How's that for a slice of fried gold?
You think this is a fucking costume? This is a way of life.
I'll be back.
Just a flesh wound. I'm not gonna hurt you. I'm just gonna bash your brains.
Take your stinking paws off me, you damn dirty ape!
I'm sorry, Ben. I'm afraid I can't do that.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive!
I guess everyone's entitled to one good scare.
Preparation for this, not that it had anything to do with anything. While I was getting ready, just getting in the Batman mode that I've been in for like 3 weeks, I watched this whole documentary on the Batmobile.
Right?
That's getting into some nerddom when you just watch something about the damn car. Todd, trivia question. Preparation for this, not that it had anything to do with anything. While I was getting ready, just getting in the Batman mode that I've been in for like 3 weeks, I watched this whole documentary on the Batmobile.
Right?
That's getting into some nerddom when you just watch something about the damn car. Todd, trivia question. Do you know what the first Batmobile looked like?
It was a red Lincoln.
That was close enough. I mean, it's a red sedan is what it was. I just did not know that before this documentary, and I just thought that was the strangest thing. Like Batman driving around in a red sedan.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing that they were talking about was that it was just kind of like, hey, here's, Batman's car just has the top up. And you put the top down. It's like, it's
yeah,
Bruce
they did
Wayne's
that on the
car.
serials
Bruce
too
Wayne's
in
car.
the 30s. They said that they would like it was a Cadillac there. It was like a 39 Cadillac or something. It was like top up, it's the Batmobile. Top down, it's Bruce Wayne's car. Finger, who actually started the idea of updating the whole thing. But I think it did it was kind of cool. It was like during the 50s, there was an editorial decision made. They said that they needed to do something different, and Batman broke his leg in a car wreck.
Yeah.
So while he's laid up, he actually designs this stuff, which is very like the Nolan movies. I thought that was kind of neat.
It was a necessity.
Yeah, this documentary I watched, it went through like every single movie's Batmobile, or like all of Batman. I mean, even the animated series, everything. They talked to all the people, so like all the directors are in it, talking about their designs, even up to like Batman 3, where H.R. Geiger designed one. And it just
that one looks wild.
Yeah, it wasn't feasible to use. They wanted to. Also, they referred to him as H.R. Giger, which turned my world upside down because I don't think I've ever heard it said that way.
I've heard it said both ways.
Yeah, I think I've heard both.
I'm not sure the exact pronunciation.
Well, so the version that they have in the books initially, like that for like after the Cadillac and George Barris, there's actually a version in between that. So I guess it's the 1940s, but it's not official, but Alex Ross has it in his garage. He's got like a full-on 1940s Batmobile.
Dang,
it's badass looking too.
That's awesome. Like the big thing I learned about Nolan's Batmobile is just how fast it could really go. Like they never really got a chance to do it. Like they had a supercharged Mercedes ML55 that was using that arm that I keep bringing up, but it couldn't keep up with the Batmobile most of the time. Like if it got on too much of a stretch of road. But they showed this thing that happened at Bob's Drive-In, where all of the Batmobiles were all in one place, and I thought that was pretty wicked.
Yeah,
and then
awesome.
Speaking of what you just were, that ventriloquist comedian, he bought Jeff Dunham. He bought the OG Burton Batmobile, cruising down the street in it, filling it up with gas. Everything.
I hate him even more. I'm looking at pictures of the H.R. Giger one. It looks like 4 novelty dildos welded together.
Yeah, it really does. I don't know how it would ever function as an actual vehicle, but it also, that documentary, one thing I thought was cool is delves into the idea of comics and modern mythology matching up, dating back to like cave drawings. They talk about all the rides that like legendary figures have. Like Odin had an 8-legged horse, and that's just the one I remember. But I always dig those kind of things because it helps with my arguing for when people tell me that comics are stupid. It's a better thing to have in your back pocket instead of like, no, you're stupid. You're stupid.
No, you.
Oh, all right. Anyway, what's up? Hello. Well, hello. That's the one. Welcome to Cinema Shock. It's a podcast dedicated to the history and evolution.
Enthusiast, which I didn't realize until he popped onto this Zoom chat wearing his own version of a Bane mask, which is just his CPAP mask.
It's just my CPAP mask and chin strap. That's all.
Because we're all old geezers. Mr. Todd A. Davis.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me back.
Thanks for being our special guest this week.
Oh, God. You almost went the whole time without saying it. I don't know why it offends me so much. But you did it, and then it bummed me out. You both took a drink at the same time, so I felt immediately obligated to fill dead air with saying stuff like this. This is how a podcast works.
You could have just edited out the dead air. That's also how a podcast works.
No, that is more work for me than talking. Talking's not work. Talking's. I watched the whole thing about Hans Zimmer, and he talked about like all the spending a year on this soundtrack, and they said, you worked a long time, and he's like, this is not work. Yes, you get tired, but it's music. You're making music. A soundtrack, and they said, you worked a long time, and he's like, this is not work. Yes, you get tired, but it's music. You're making music. This is what I do, and the operative word here is like when you're making music, you're playing music. So I spent a year playing, and that's a good way to talking is like playing for me. So I just will keep rambling, clearly. And so that's easier than editing.
Easier for you, not necessarily for the audience who has to listen to it. Right. Welcome to week 3, the final week, the wrap up to our look at Christopher Nolan's Dark Knight Trilogy. This has been fun. When was the last time you guys watched these movies? I know Gary said it had been a long time.
They're in pretty steady rotation for me, and
yeah,
I think I enjoy.
You rewatch them once a year?
Yeah. Easy,
at least once a year.
Once a year. Yeah, probably more often than that.
All right.
I think I enjoy.
You rewatch them once a year?
Yeah. Easy,
at least once
easy
a year.
Once a year. Yeah, probably more often than that.
All right.
So I have not seen this movie since the theaters. This one.
Okay.
I definitely not. Definitely have not. And I've seen the other one since, but it's been a while for both of them. But this one, I definitely only saw it in the theater.
Okay. All right.
Let the games begin.
Oh, there it is.
Well, as we discussed last week, The Dark Knight, the second film in the trilogy, was a major success. I don't think it was quite the highest grossing Batman film, but it was way up there. It was one of the highest grossing films of 2008. So, of course, after that major success, not just commercial, but critical as well, won all kinds of awards, Warner Brothers signed Nolan on. They actually signed him on to direct Inception. They were like, what do you want to do, Chris? And this is what he wanted to do. He wasn't actually sure if he wanted to come back for another Batman movie at that time. So he signed on to direct Inception in 2010. And of course, it was yet again another major success, both critically and commercially. This is a trend that we're seeing with Christopher Nolan's movies up until this year, I guess.
Yeah, and hardly any of that's his fault.
Well, it's arguably partially his fault for insisting that Tenet come out in theaters this year. So
okay, fair enough.
Yeah. He waited till next year, maybe it would have made a lot more money.
Yeah, good point.
But he did follow up Inception 2 years later with the third and final film of his Batman trilogy, The Dark Knight Rises.
There's a storm coming.
You sound like you're looking forward to it.
I'm adaptable.
What are you?
I'm Gotham's.
Why didn't you just kill me?
Your punishment must be more severe.
Do you think he's coming back?
I don't know. Why would you run, Bane?
You should be as afraid of him as I am.
I won't bury you. I've buried enough members of the Wayne family.
You don't owe these people anymore. You've given them everything.
Not everything. Not yet.
mother warned me about getting into cars with strange men.
This isn't a car.
So as I mentioned, Nolan, he was initially helped out a story with his brother, Jonah, and David S. Goyer. They developed a story that he thought, that's what he goes by. That's what he prefers to go by.
Really?
Yep.
Well, why? That doesn't even make sense.
Why? Jonah.
J-O-N-A.
Take the than off of it.
Do people named Jonathan go by Jonah often?
I've never known.
Is that a normal thing for Jonathans?
I don't know, Gary, but this is what Mr. Nolan prefers to go by. If you see any interviews with anyone speaking about him, they refer to him as Jonah. He only goes by Jonathan on like screen credits.
All right. Well, you know what? I'm not going to sit here and pretend like the Nolan brothers are the most normal people in the world, probably. So
they have two very different accents.
I was going to ask you about that on this episode. Why in everything that I watch, why does Jonathan Nolan not have an English accent?
Well, he grew up in America.
And Christopher didn't?
He grew up, we discussed this. He grew up partially in America.
Nolan not have an English accent.
Well, he grew up in America.
And Christopher didn't?
We discussed this. He grew up partially in America and partially in England.
Well,
he has dual citizenship.
What's the age difference on them? Jonathan's much younger.
I wouldn't say much younger, but a few years younger.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't know. I did not research, Gary, to answer your question, the amount of time that each spent in each place, but I would wager to guess that Christopher spent more time in England than his brother did, thus picking up that accent. So
I wonder if he ever made fun of him for it.
Which one?
Either.
Chris Nolan is 6 years older.
Okay, so that's not a huge difference.
Yeah.
Anyway, they worked out a story that Christopher Nolan thought would bring the story to a satisfactory conclusion, because that was always his intent and always kind of David S. Goyer's intent. David S. Goyer originally planned for it, was not what ended up happening, because as we discussed, his original treatment had Two-Face as the bad guy in the third film, where that storyline kind of got condensed into The Dark Knight. But he always said, if you read interviews with David S. Goyer talking about The Dark Knight Rises, he says that he always knew what the final shot of the trilogy would be. He always had that in his mind. And he says that the final shot in The Dark Knight Rises is what he originally intended. So there are, of course, parts of his original treatment that made it into this final film, even though they kind of had to completely redo the main story, including the main villain.
Well, I'm sure, Heath passing away probably
definitely
threw a wrench in the works as well.
Which is the ultimate joke when you think about it.
But you're right, Todd. I mean, it did require them to go in a different apprehended by Batman, but he's very much still alive. And it's hard to say if Nolan would have included Ledger in the sequel. For one, he wasn't that keen on doing a third film anyway, but he also doesn't like to repeat himself, although members of Ledger's family have said that Heath Ledger was very happy. He loved the work that he did on The Dark Knight and spoke about the possibility of coming back for a third film. So it's hard to say. We don't know. We'll never know what may have happened or what that third film may have looked like had Heath Ledger not passed away. But Christopher Nolan, he has said, this is actually, I'll read a specific quote from him. He says that on a more superficial level, I have to ask, how many good third movies in a franchise can people name? So he was hesitant to come back for a third film because, by his own admission, a lot of times a third film in a trilogy fails to live up to the previous films. Right. A lot of times the second film does, but especially the third film in a trilogy film, because by his own admission, a lot of times a third film in a trilogy fails to live up to the previous films. Right. A lot of times the second film does, but especially the third film in a trilogy. Even in a great trilogy like, let's say, Star Wars or Back to the Future, the third film is generally considered the lesser of the three, even if it's still not bad.
Yeah,
you know what I mean?
Yeah, you're absolutely right.
What happens more often nowadays, you up your chances if you bring back the exact creative team that's been working on this complete story the whole time, which they did do. And I do believe like Bruce's story does feel like a definitive 3-part structure.
It does. And I think, and that was intentional by them, even if they didn't have the whole thing mapped out from the beginning. You know, like they didn't have the third film. They didn't start writing this third film until after they'd finished The Dark Knight. So it wasn't like they had mapped out like a first, second, and third act, but they did make it feel like that was planned. Third film, they didn't start writing this third film until after they'd finished The Dark Knight. So it wasn't like they had mapped out like a first, second, and third act, but they did make it feel like that was planned.
I read some of the stuff that one of the big things for Goyer was that he kind of considered a challenge through this whole thing when he originally even first thought about, like, if I were making a Batman story, was that he wanted a big role of it. And this goes back to Nolan casting Bale as Batman, something he was talking about back on Batman Begins, is that he wanted to see if they could just get people to care about Bruce Wayne, the character, and not just when he's in costume.
Yeah.
And I really think they succeeded in that by the time this one rolls around, because
I think they succeed with that from the first film, honestly, because this is, I've said this on the previous two episodes, but this trilogy is Bruce Wayne's story more than it's the Batman story.
Yeah,
the Batman,
I guess
even in the
by the time this movie rolls around, he's become this thing that Alfred's been talking about since day one and warning against. Now he's in this situation where he's frozen in time. His adventures, all his Batmaning, they've damaged him seemingly, like, physically, beyond repair, and not just physically, emotionally too. It's like he's addicted to this thing, and he's full of anger and everything else. And if Gotham's fixed, he's got nothing to push back against, so he's got no purpose. And it's something they've built up to talking about through all the movies. And now he's just this older, disheveled, homeless looking dude standing in the window of his mansion, just like Homelander in The Boys, or Louis C.K. just like jerking off while he looks out on the city, and he just sounds really angry. And there's like all these stories in Gotham about the orgasms he has as in the Batman voice. Like,
Gary,
I'm Batman!
Gary, I think
the orgasms he has as in the Batman voice. Like,
Gary,
I'm Batman!
Gary, I think
we've gone off the rails a little bit here, Gary.
Projecting onto this is called fanfic.
I want you to tell all your friends about me.
Well, it's interesting though, because one thing, I don't think we mentioned this, but one of the films that Nolan was working on, I think prior to Batman Begins, I believe, one of the films he was working on, it may have been between Batman Begins and The Dark Knight, I can't remember, but that kind of fell through, was a Howard Hughes biopic. He worked for several years on doing a Howard Hughes biopic. He ended up not doing it because he found out that Martin Scorsese was doing The Aviator, and you don't want to try to make the same kind of movie that Martin Scorsese is making, because you're going to lose that battle. So he just shelved that project. So it's kind of interesting that he sort of puts Bruce Wayne in Howard Hughes mode by making him a rich hermit who never leaves, lives in his bathrobe all the time.
Well, they kind of they addressed that directly in dialogue. And to what Gary was saying earlier, that was because Kat and I were talking about it last night, and she said, he doesn't leave the house. That doesn't seem very Bruce Wayne-like. And I said, well, you have to remember that he, on the plane back from Iceland, in the very first movie, he talks about, as a man, he can be destroyed, but as a symbol, he can be incorruptible, everlasting. And then, Joker sort of acknowledges, like, you really are incorruptible, aren't you? It's only once they get to the end of Dark Knight that he finally pulls the trigger on truly shedding what was holding him back from becoming that symbol completely. And what was holding him back from becoming that symbol completely was the last few remaining shreds of Bruce Wayne. Yeah. So once that is shed, he's been hanging out at the house, just doing his thing. He's been
practicing his archery.
Practicing his archery, yeah. But I mean, he's not. He at that point, he's not Bruce Wayne anymore. He's Batman, and to keep up the safety of the city with all the criminals in Gotham. Yes, it's based on a lie, but the only way he can do that is keeping his ass at home.
Maintain the lie.
Yeah, stay at home, which is what we've been doing through this whole pandemic. Keep your ass at home, people.
So once he did sign on, once he was convinced that he had a story that he could work with. Warner Brothers, he kind of clashed with the studio over who to include as a villain, because obviously Heath Ledger's work as the Joker is iconic. I mean, unmatchable. They, of course, wanted a villain that was similar to the Joker because that had worked so well, because that's what studios in Hollywood do. That's like, oh, you did the Riddler. And I agree that the Riddler is just too similar to the Joker. And you got to go in a completely different direction, which is what he did with the character of Bane.
He was like, I already put Mr. Reese in the second one, you dipshits. Aren't you even watching my movies? And then Jonathan's in the background. Chris, shut up with the accent.
That's his real accent, Gary. It's not a fake accent.
That's probably how it goes.
Nolan
goes in the Nolan household, baby.
Nolan was actually unfamiliar with the character of Bane because, Nolan was a Batman fan, but he wasn't like a Batman super fan. And Bane's stuff came, I would say you could consider that later in Batman's run, because that was in the 90s, right? Early 90s, early to mid 90s?
Yeah, early to mid 90s. Yeah, 93 to 95, I think.
Yeah, but he did, a lot of research, and he noted that because the character was so vastly different from the Joker, that he would be an entire...
Nolan goes in the Nolan household, baby.
Nolan was actually unfamiliar with the character of Bane because, Nolan was a Batman fan, but he wasn't like a Batman super fan. And Bane's stuff came, I would say you could consider that later in Batman's run, because that was in the 90s, right? Early 90s, early to mid 90s?
Yeah, early to mid 90s. Yeah, 93 to 95, I think.
Yeah, but he did, a lot of research, and he noted that because the character was so vastly different from the Joker, that he would be an entirely new kind of threat for Batman in multiple ways. I mean, he was, well, of course, the version that they ended up creating of Bane was very much a very disciplined, but he was also a physical threat to Batman, which the Joker was not. The Joker, if the Batman and the Joker if it was just a fist fight, Batman wins easily, but that's not the kind of villain that the Joker is. That is very much the kind of villain that Bane is, especially in the comic book, where he is almost entirely nothing but brute strength, barely even speaking,
Yeah. Well, I appreciated, because I mean, when I got into really started getting heavily into comics was right around the time that they had introduced Bane. So this was a very important storyline for me. And I just remember him being, and he kind of looked like a luchador, and he had the tubes running the whole thing, but he was pretty damn menacing.
Yeah, I mean the Nightfall storyline is really good.
Yeah, well, he plots out he figures out on his own who Batman is in the comics, and then tracks him down, then meticulously picks him apart, getting him into all these different situations, so that by the time he fights him, he's already beaten down and tired, and he knows
and that's why that's smart. And that makes him an even bigger threat.
See, I saw some stuff with Jonathan Nolan, that he had been familiar with the character, that, Nolan and Goyer brought it to him. Goyer wanted him most, and Chris was very anti-Bane at first. But Goyer had to sit him down and say, hold on. We're going to do the Christopher Nolan version of Bane. Jonathan pointed out to Chris, he's like, okay, hey, all I do remember about this guy from the comics is that he's the first person that really physically damaged Batman and has this residual imprint on his psyche. This could be really good. Yeah. And they said that Chris started to buy into it. Goyer had to talk to him about look, we could make this totally your jam. This, he's creepy, physical, distorted. We'll focus on the cerebral side of this thing. So that's why they should have hired the cerebral assassin, the game, Triple H. But
really awesome.
He's got the
physique. He does have the physique.
He's got the physique.
That is what he has.
And he's got a face for...
and deception are powerful weapons.
He's got a face for a character who wears a mask the entire time.
Oh, man.
So after he'd cracked the story of the film, David S. Goyer and Jonathan Nolan began working on the screenplay, although Goyer actually had to leave during pre-production to begin work on Man of Steel, which, if you'll remember, Man of Steel was actually being produced by Christopher Nolan. Christopher Nolan actually, I think, has a story credit on it, if I'm not mistaken. But
I think so.
David S. Goyer actually wrote the screenplay for that. So Jonathan continued to write the script based on the story that they'd all come up with. Of course, we already mentioned it, but one of the major influences, one of the major inspirations for the story for the writers was the 1993 Batman story Nightfall, which is where Bane breaks Batman's back. It's a great story. It's one of the first for the writers was the 1993 Batman story Nightfall, which is where Bane breaks Batman's back. It's a great story. It's one of the first Batman stories I really got into, like a long form story that I really got into. I remember buying the trade paperback when I was in, I guess, middle school at that point. And but of course it goes on longer, and it introduces Azrael and all this other stuff that, of course, this movie doesn't touch on at all. But the character of Bane and him breaking Batman's back comes directly from that story. Right. Of course, Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns was also a major inspiration, as well as the 1999 story No Man's Land, which you see a major influence on in this with Bane's kind of occupation of Gotham, which is another really great Batman story if you haven't read it.
Yeah, it's really fantastic because it just shows the breakdown of the society of Gotham into this very tribal, city ends up to be.
And that's very apparent when you watch the movie with that mindset, because A Tale of Two Cities is all about class warfare, essentially. The differences between the haves and the have-nots. It's about duality. The main characters are basically doubles, which is something that is a recurring motif throughout this whole series, especially with the duality, of course, of Batman and Bruce Wayne.
I saw some straight up stuff with Christopher Nolan talking about that exact thing, that just with it was important to him for like this Bane, even wardrobe wise, we'll get into in a little bit, but that he's a mercenary. He's very smart. He's somebody who would storm a city. He's that his costume's an amalgam of all these things. But he wants it to be more like look like a Second World War guy or a Roman gladiator or something.
He wanted this to feel like a historical epic.
Yeah, that there was a sense too of is I think the term he used.
Well, Nolan actually, I mean, the movie specifically like overtly references A Tale of Two Cities, because when Gordon is giving his eulogy at the end, he's literally reading from A Tale of Two Cities. He's reading like one of the last passages from the book.
Yeah.
Right? So it's very clear that that's what he's doing.
Also, the script was, like I heard on the first draft, like 400 pages. So they were shooting for the actual novel length too.
And The Dark Knight Rises would reunite Nolan with a lot of his previous collaborators, including cinematographer Wally Pfister. I think this is their 7th movie together. Production designer Nathan Crowley, the guy who designed the Bat Pod and the Batmobile, or the Tumbler. Editor Lee Smith, and of course, composer Hans Zimmer once again. Although, on this one, Hans Zimmer did it by himself. Hans Zimmer,
I noticed that.
James Newton Howard didn't come around this time because he actually opted not to return. He was invited. Hans Zimmer,
I noticed that.
James Newton Howard didn't come around this time because he actually opted not to return. He was invited, but Hans Zimmer, and the way that he says it is because Hans Zimmer and Christopher Nolan had really established a chemistry together working on Inception in between the two films, that he felt like he would feel like a third wheel if he came back for this movie,
Yeah. On a side note really quick too, I meant to mention it at the top of the show, but I saw a really cute side story about the Nolan brothers that Chris gave Jonathan The Dark Knight Returns and Year One for his 13th birthday.
Oh.
And 13 years later.
Those are good gifts.
Yeah. 13 years later is when Batman Begins premiered. So
nice.
Just a side note. I don't know. It has nothing to do with anything you just said, except that you can probably imagine he's like, here, take these books. They're very good. And then Jonathan like, would you shut the fuck up, Chris, with that accent? Always. Chris gave Jonathan The Dark Knight Returns and Year One for his 13th birthday.
Oh.
And 13 years later.
Those are good gifts.
Yeah. 13 years later is when Batman Begins premiered. So
nice.
Just a side note. I don't know. It has nothing to do with anything you just said, except that you can probably imagine he's like, here, take these books. They're very good. And then Jonathan like, would you shut the fuck up, Chris, with that accent? Always.
I don't know why you're projecting some sort of anger between these two brothers who seem to genuinely care for each other.
Yeah, well, that's how everybody seems on the outside, Justin. I'm exposing the dark underbelly of the Nolan universe.
Oh.
So, in addition to returning crew members,
you think darkness is your ally?
Oh my god! So, in addition to the returning crew members, several key cast members, including Christian Bale, Michael Caine, Gary Oldman, and Morgan Freeman, all return. But this movie introduces a lot of new. Never once is the word Catwoman uttered in this, which would be kind of silly in the context of Christopher Nolan's world, I think. But Anne Hathaway, she auditioned for this role, not even knowing which role she was auditioning for. She knew she was auditioning for the new Batman movie directed by Christopher Nolan, but she only found out afterwards when she was offered the role that it was Selena Kyle that she was being offered.
I saw some stuff that said she was like thinking maybe Harley Quinn or something like that is what she was thinking was happening. I
can't imagine a Nolan version of Harley Quinn.
Yeah, it doesn't really seem to fit. His Joker doesn't seem to have any interest in that sort of thing.
Yeah.
She knocks it out of the park, though. She's great.
Anne Hathaway?
Yeah.
Yeah, she's incredible, man. Like I really like her as an actress. And I've recently watched a couple things with her in it because, not just this, but I rewatched Interstellar recently, and I watched Les Mis the other night because I just wanted to be fucking sad, I guess. Selena is pretending to be someone else, like when she's a waitress.
She literally does it like on turns on a dime, like in several scenes.
Yeah, like when she first meets Bruce, when she kind of turns it off, and same again when she's in that meeting when she uses the what's his face's cell phone, and then she starts screaming and then just turns it off. It's really great. It's a really fun, but she's also, I think, pretty physically convincing. She trained extensively in martial arts for this. I was reading an interview with her today, and that the moment where she meets Bruce and she does that backflip out of the window, I assumed that was some sort of effect because it's so fluid. She really did that. She did the backflip out of that window on her own. Wasn't a stunt person. Wasn't a digital where they put the digital stunt, the face over the stunt person,
right,
or anything like that. It was her doing a backflip out of a window.
I gained a lot of respect for her after reading interviews and seeing things with this about Catwoman being in the movie. But Jonathan was very adamant that she has to be part of the story, especially if this is going to be their trilogy. He doesn't think that there's a complete Batman story without Catwoman, so it wouldn't do it justice.
Right, because they were trying to encompass as much of the whole of the Batman mythos as they could within 3 movies, and
and she
obviously you can't include every character, but you have to include Catwoman.
Well, he thought that she offered a shade of gray that Batman wouldn't be completely familiar with, having dealt with so many villains. And for Bruce, also, he doesn't have anybody like her except maybe Alfred
who does not look nearly as good in the outfit.
Well, you haven't seen him in the outfit, to be fair.
To be fair.
But she's not amused by Bruce. She's not intimidated by Batman. But he can be himself. She runs around in a mask. She gets it too. But of course, Nolan has to make it his own. He grounds the character a lot. His Catwoman definitely has that femme fatale look.
Very much, yeah.
She's a grifter.
Well, the two things that I saw that really impressed me were because obviously she did her homework and training in terms of the martial arts and the stunt work and everything. But I was really impressed with her manipulation of the handgun in that barroom scene.
Yeah.
And then to listen to her talk about going back to the first appearance of Catwoman and seeing what Bob Kane and Bill Finger based the character on, and then her taking acting cues from those particular actresses from the 30s and 40s.
Well, it was specifically Hedy Lamarr.
Yes.
Hedy Lamarr is who they modeled Catwoman after.
Right.
When they had originally created the character. So she based her entire performance on Hedy Lamarr, especially the voice.
That's one of the things I was talking about when I was gaining respect for her, because it's like she knows
so she based her entire performance on Hedy Lamarr, especially the voice.
That's one of the things I was talking about when I was gaining respect for her, because it's like she knows what she's just very intelligent. She said she literally didn't study any other screen version of Catwoman because she knew that her Catwoman had to be Christopher Nolan's Catwoman.
Right. You can't you can't compare it to Michelle Pfeiffer, who I love her version of Catwoman, but she is, she's sexed up, like, you know, it's a very different version that fits in Burton's world. It would not fit in this one.
But it's a cool, pleasing moment for a comic book fan to see, like, that she's also like, I dove in, and I know that Bob Kane was a huge Hedy Lamarr fan, and this was who he was thinking of when he made Catwoman. And so instead, I dove into the filmography of Hedy Lamarr and picked up style and techniques, mannerisms, that kind of thing.
She also watched a lot of Cat.
This was who he was thinking of when he made Catwoman. And so instead, I dove into the filmography of Hedy Lamarr and picked up style and techniques, mannerisms, that kind of thing. She
also watched a lot of Cat videos on YouTube, she said.
Oh,
so
well,
the piano
playing certain parts of those videos I'd like to see. You know what I'm saying?
Hey,
she does.
Just the licking yourself part's what I mean.
Oh, ew.
I don't know. I mean, I got 2 cats. That's what they do, and it's not.
That's mostly what cats do. Honestly,
I don't want to be inappropriate, but it's not as cool to see
Horn.
as it would be Anne Hathaway doing it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I get it. But yeah, I think she's really outstanding in the role. I think she's got the physicality for it. She wears the costume well. I like the costume design. I like the. I thought it was silly at first, but I kind of like the way that her goggles look a little bit like cat ears when she puts.
Thinking about it, these goggles that are like night vision that have, like, they've got the jeweler's thing on it. I can't think of what that's called. And then just there's like all this stuff on them, but then she could just like flip them back, and it just kind of looks like cat ears. It's just, I don't know, kind of
fun.
Yeah.
So of course the other major character that gets added to this is Tom Hardy's Bane. So after being cast as Bane, Tom Hardy, he gained 30 pounds of muscle for the role. He's pretty jacked in the role because Tom Hardy's not a big dude. He's like 5'9". He's not like a big hulking guy, but he gained a lot of muscle for this. And of course, Bane, as we mentioned before, had been in Joel Schumacher's Batman and Robin. We got less than stellar results from that version of Bane, I would say. Yeah. So Hardy made very specific. He made pains to create a much more menacing character, because that character in Batman and Robin is pretty goofy and not very scary because he's silly. That version was and not very scary because he's silly. That version was played by Robert Swenson, who was I think a professional wrestler.
He was an ex-professional wrestler, aka Jeep Swenson. Jeep Swenson. And I looked this up.
I would implore you to go look at Robert Swenson's Wikipedia profile and look at the photo that they have chosen of him.
Oh, wait a minute. Now I'm going to do that. I will say, just as I'm looking here, that I looked up the number of people named Jeep in the U.S., and it's like at 166. What is this photo? Swenson with his wife and daughter in 1996, and everybody appears to be naked.
Yes, they appear to be nude, and he is very wide. But I don't know why you would take a photo like that with your wife and daughter in it. It's very strange. She's not like a baby. She's like a full-grown person.
That is very odd.
It's disturbing.
We'll be respectful since he passed away in 1997, apparently.
Yeah, he had a heart attack, I think.
1997, apparently.
Yeah, he had a heart attack, I think.
All right, just saying. Don't, better daughter doesn't show that to the hubby or anything.
So Tom Hardy, in order to create a more menacing character, one thing that he wanted to do is he wanted to create a distinct contradiction between the character's voice and the character's physical appearance. So in an interview with Vulture, he talks about where he got this voice. Part of it, the accent is kind of a combination of two things. It's one, it's based on the character's comic book origins, who I think he's South American in the comic.
Yeah, he's definitely Latin American. He's from like a what I looked this up earlier, and it is like somewhere off the Caribbean or something. But yeah,
but he also claims to have based it on the voice of a gypsy bare knuckle boxer, an Irish guy by the name of Bartley Gorman. So I'm going to play a clip so that you can hear what Bartley Gorman sounds like.
Kill him. So you know what I mean? There ain't no referee going to jump in. Oh, he's got a cut over his eye. See what I mean? Stop it. There's a cut over his eye. There's no stop it. Not if you rip my heart out, they wouldn't stop it. Before me, there's always been kings of the gypsies. Before me, Uriah Burton, Big Just, was a king of the gypsies. And when he died, I inherited his title. I fought Johnny Fletcher. Then I become the champion of the gypsies. King of the Gypsies.
The King of the Gypsies, Justin. That's who he is.
That's actually that clip is from a documentary called "The King of the Gypsies." That's about Bartley Gorman, but interesting character.
Yeah, I saw like where the voice put people off. I mean, I think probably because everybody has this idea of what Bane would sound like, but Hardy
in the comics, he's got an odd accent, doesn't he? Don't they stylize his dialogue kind of in a weird way?
Not really.
No, maybe I'm thinking of something. They stylize his dialogue kind of in a weird way.
Not really.
No, maybe I'm thinking
I
of
feel like
something
they do lean into maybe they have accent stuff in certain places, but I just think everybody has an idea of like what Bane would sound like.
Right.
Like, with maybe like a deep voice or something menacing, but Hardy like turns it completely on his head. I saw a couple of interviews where he did say, obviously Bartley Gorman, like you mentioned, but he started with an idea of, he said, Bane is somebody who's in tremendous pain all of the time. So he pictured him with like this older voice, sort of like a Richard Burton, he said, I suppose, slightly florid, camp English villain in many ways, but it's something that's just off center. And he said, but the other parts he knew people would be concerned with is Bane's Latin American descent. And he said that taking that into mind, I started going back into Latin and looked at the original Latin and sort of came out with this Romani underpinned the Latin, but like a Romani Latin.
That makes, that's a good decision on his part. Because if he had just done like a straight up Latin American accent, he could as a clearly a very white guy, like that would probably not have gone over very well,
Yeah, that's true. That's a good point.
I just think there was I see why he would choose that, and he wanted him to sound very old and very like weathered and kind of beaten, but the point of him sounding like he'd been in pain is a good choice. I just question how there's some very strong dialogue here in this movie that he gets, and I think some of it doesn't land as well because of the accent or because of the mask or because of post-production design on the voice. And I don't know, it's voice, and I don't know, it's I get it, and everybody's shooting for the moon in this one.
Yeah, I don't think you're
some
alone.
of it doesn't land as well as I think
I happen to be a fan of it myself, but yeah, that's just Tom Hardy, and I think one of the things you get with Tom Hardy is Nolan seems to do this, like trust your actor to pick the right thing.
Yeah, he's definitely letting the actor do their own thing, because that's not a voice that Christopher Nolan picked out. I understand people not digging it because it's a bizarre choice. But the more I've seen this film, I've probably seen it maybe 3 or 4 times before this. Maybe this is probably my 3rd time seeing it, maybe 4th. I like it more and more each time. I think it's it's really fun. It's a fun voice, and I think it's pretty effective. I don't think it. I know that people thought it was kind of goofy when this movie. I know that people thought it was kind of goofy when this movie first came out. That was one of the things that people often commented on, but it's always worked for me. It's never come across as silly. It's come across as weird.
Well, certainly. It's certainly weird, but I think the idea that to this day people still remember, I having only seen the movie in the theaters, still remember what Bane sounds like and Bane quotes and stuff like that. So for better or worse, it worked at least in that aspect of it. And I know that, I expect that Christopher Nolan knew what he was getting into. I saw plenty of interviews where he said he knew right away Tom Hardy, like as soon as they decided what this role was, supposedly like called him up and said, I think the actual conversation they say they had is like, he said, I have this role. I'd love for you to do it. You might not like it because you're going to be wearing a mask the whole time. And he pitches the whole thing to Tom, and Tom says, he said, like, so I'm going to travel the fucking and, but like you said too, he puts on that muscle, and Nolan and Tom decided early on, it's like it's a different kind of build. It's not just any kind of muscle. It's like he doesn't want Mr. Universe. He needs to be a badass, tough guy, circus strongman style. So he's bulking and practicing fighting constantly, which sounds familiar from the first movie. He said, and so I don't think you could get anybody better to match the physical style of acting that Christian Bale does than Tom Hardy.
And of course Nolan and Hardy had worked together on Inception before this, because Tom Hardy has a pretty significant role in that. The other two cast members that were added to this, Marion Cotillard and Joseph Gordon-Levitt, were also in Inception. So Marion Cotillard plays Miranda Tate, aka Talia al Ghul, as we find out towards the end of the film, and then Joseph Gordon plays a new character who's not based on anyone from the comics by the name of John Blake in Inception. So Marion Cotillard plays Miranda Tate, aka Talia al Ghul, as we find out towards the end of the film, and then Joseph Gordon plays a new character who's not based on anyone from the comics by the name of John Blake.
Marion Cotillard, he wanted her too. I saw a bunch of stuff about that. I just really wanted her. He invited her initially in 2010, and she was pregnant, and she didn't know if she'd be able to make it, but he just didn't take her out as the person who was playing Miranda Tate. And eventually she came back. She was even filming in France at the same time. She flew back and forth to do the role. And Nolan talks about he knew then and saw it during the filming. She's Superwoman. She just gave birth, and then it's amazing to see how hard she works. And that's part of the reason he wanted her.
I think knowing Chris Nolan's affinity for people's eyes, I think she has obviously French, but there's an unpinpointable exoticness to it. And I think which makes her very captivating on screen.
Yeah, so, she's really excellent. Even in a fairly not showy role like this is, because it's a fairly straightforward role for the majority of the film, but I think she pulls it off nicely.
Yeah. I saw that besides just side note stuff, but for Catwoman, besides Anne Hathaway, Natalie Portman, Keira Knightley, Kate Mara, Gemma Arterton, Jessica Biel, Blake Lively, Lady Gaga, and Charlotte Riley, who was Tom Hardy's fiance at the time. They all auditioned for Selena Kyle, but Hathaway, Biel, and Mara all went past and got screen tested, actually. So
I could honestly see any of them in the role.
Yeah, I could see it too.
I could definitely see. You said Kate Mara or Rooney?
Yeah, Kate Mara.
Kate Mara. Yeah, I could see Kate Mara doing that. Even on DVDs and Blu-rays or whatever, doesn't including things like that. Doesn't including. I think Christian Bale's audition might have shown up, but even he wasn't very happy that was on one of the Blu-rays. Nolan has said he doesn't including deleted scenes necessarily or outtakes or bloopers or anything like that, because he's that's not what the actor signed up to show. They signed up to show the final product, so it's not really fair to them to release this footage that's wasn't ever intended to be seen by anyone but that inside crew.
One thing I thought was interesting that a reviewer pointed out just on the casting side of this is just that I forget where it was. I read it, so sorry, but they pointed out this movie has 6 Oscar winners in it, between Christian Bale, Michael Caine, Morgan Freeman, Gary Oldman, Marion Cotillard, and Anne Hathaway. Has 3 Oscar nominees, Tom Connery. And if you want to get crazy, you can count Maggie Gyllenhaal and archive footage. And so you've got 10 Oscar nominees in this movie, which is just crazy wild for a comic book movie.
Third part of a comic book trilogy.
Right. Yeah.
So in looking for new locations for this film, especially for the location of the prison where Bane and Bruce Wayne spend time, Nolan had his location scouts going all over the world. They went to they looked to India, they looked to Romania, they looked to Michigan, which is odd. But they were looking at the Turda salt mines in Romania. They ended up shooting it in India. And as he had done in The Dark Knight, he shot a lot of the film in the IMAX format. The Dark Knight Rises actually has over twice as much IMAX footage as The Dark Knight. It's got over an hour. The Dark Knight had about 28 minutes.
I think a lot of that, cinematographer Wally Feister, they had kind of refined their style with the IMAX shooting. And so they were kind of digging it.
Dark Knight had about 28 minutes.
I think a lot of that, cinematographer Wally Feister, they had kind of refined their style with the IMAX shooting. And so they were kind of digging it. And
Nolan said he'd shoot the whole movie in IMAX if he could.
Yeah, they wanted to do that, and I think they were getting pressure. Some stuff I read said they were getting pressure to do 3D, which they were both like, "No, f you, we're not doing 3D." But yeah, like you said, I think approximately it was like 1 hour 12 minutes. It was like 1/3 of the movie ended up being IMAX, and the rest of it they did in 35 millimeter or this like 70 millimeter like Vista film or something. I forget what they called it, which is close but not quite IMAX.
But different cameras though, not quite as unwieldy.
Right. Well, what they did this time is, I mean, they worked with Panavision and retooled the IMAX cameras completely, like retooled the viewfinders, the lenses. Weiser got with them. They designed like a whole new lens for the IMAX that was this time is, I mean, they worked with Panavision and retooled the IMAX cameras completely, like retooled the viewfinders, the lenses. Weiser got with them. They designed like a whole new lens for the IMAX that was able to like turn all the way up, but like shoot in dark or something. It was, it's a lot more technological than I'm familiar with, but yeah, they just, the only times it's not used, it gets like every action scene, like all the major action at least is in IMAX. But it was like, Justin mentioned, I think last episode, that they're loud. They're really loud. And so they didn't want to use it in scenes where it would affect performances, either from the sound or just being intrusive in general. Some of the stuff I read said Nolan apparently hates ADR, like re-recording dialogue. So he thinks it's like never going to be better than in the moment on the day. So they obviously backed off there.
Yeah, right. So using it for action scenes makes sense, but it also forces them to shoot a little bit differently because it is, as we said, shaped differently, and they try to fit as much like as they can within that IMAX frame. And it's really striking visually in some of these scenes. I mean, it's really cool. Obviously, the opening plane heist, like it just gives it a scope of epicness that you don't get otherwise. And part of that comes from Nolan's insistence to shoot on location as well. We talked about this a little bit in the last couple movies, especially in Batman Begins, where they go and they shot on a fucking glacier.
Watching it this far out from when it was released, I still like that opening plane stuff. Like I was like, my God, this movie is beautiful. Like it is just, and that's been one of the big takeaways for these movies that I don't know if the legacy reflects on that enough, like just how gorgeously shot these movies are, and and just Apple real.
It's like all practical shooting in air. Like
it's all of this movie is more real than I think people realize, and it's like a process. Like I mean, they brought in different plane parts and different planes from all over the freaking world to like make this one scene happen, and like the only parts that aren't actually a plane in the air is, I mean, like they actually had a plane on a gimbal that like turned up, right? So you could have the scenes like falling through the cabin or whatever. But I mean, they trained skydivers to like, they tried it with dummies and stuff, but they trained like skydivers to stage the attack on the plane, like wing walking and flying out the back of it and stuff. It's just
like, how cool of a job.
I mean,
so
not to me.
What are you doing at work? We're learning how to jump from one plane to another plane to make it. And
I mean, and like even the plane, like they did. So like, I think the only digital parts, the plane's upright and it's tight and the wings break off and stuff. I think that part was done digitally, but like the actual plane dropping down, they had to like search forever to find like areas to drop a plane
fuselage,
an entire plane.
Where's it okay to do this? Is like they were like, it's harder than you think to find a spot.
Well, speaking to how epic this movie feels, so they started filming began in Jodhpur, India at the, I'm probably gonna butcher this name, but the Mirangar Fort. So that's where they shoot. I mean, it's the footage is clear in the film. It's when Bruce comes out of the well.
Yeah.
But then they moved to Pittsburgh. And in Pittsburgh, they shot in several locations, most notably at Heinz Field. So this is where it comes into that sort of epic scale of filmmaking, because
Steeler Nation, baby.
Yeah, you're a Steelers fan, right?
I am.
So Heinz Field stood in for the stadium where the Gotham football team, the Gotham Rogues, played, and several. Yeah, you're a Steelers fan, right?
I am.
So Heinz Field stood in for the stadium where the Gotham football team, the Gotham Rogues, played, and several members of the Steelers appear in the film. You see Ben Roethlisberger and several others in there. This is where it gets crazy. They brought in more than 11,000 extras for this scene, which is not something that filmmakers do now. They'll usually digitally create crowds. They'll bring in a crowd to fill in one section of the stadium, and then they'll just multiply that over the course of the entire stadium. But no, they just brought in 11,000 people into Heinz Stadium to be in this Batman movie.
Yep. I saw some stuff with what's Nolan's wife's name? Who's the producer?
Emma Thomas.
Emma Thomas. Yeah, she's talking about this. I thought this was funny. She's like, we wanted to have some actual people there. But we're like, how do we get a crowd in this stadium? And then she's like, turns out there's a company called Big Crowds Company. And
wonder what they do.
Show up.
I mean, listen, you tell a bunch of people from Pittsburgh that they can come not only hang out in Heinz Field and watch the Pittsburgh Steelers be in a movie, but it's also a Batman movie. People are going to show up.
They said they'd hope they'd stay till lunch because, they're just sitting in stands all day. But they think that by the end of the day, the shooting day, they had the same number of people still there.
A buddy of mine and his girlfriend at the time went. And they're in the stadium, and it was just, I mean, they drove from Virginia. Like,
oh wow!
I think if you just put the call out there of like,
people
hey,
are gonna show up,
Batman.
It's just like another Pittsburgh native, Mr. George Romero. When they made a call for people to come be in a George Romero zombie movie, Pittsburgh residents want to do that.
Yeah.
Speaking of George Romero, they did also shoot several scenes at Carnegie Mellon University.
Oh yeah, I saw that.
George Romero. They did also shoot several scenes at Carnegie Mellon University.
Oh yeah, I saw that. I'm glad you brought that up. That is amazing. To tie it into our last series, that whole thing at the end is the fight scene with Bane and Batman on the stairs. That's at Carnegie Mellon University, and so that's fun. It
was at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the old Romero stomping grounds around
Savini.
And Savini. It's
so, I want to talk that sequence in the stadium, in the football stadium, is I think one of the best sequences in the entire film because it is so well done. It's one of a couple of moments in the film where you really see how good Nolan is at creating these big set pieces because it builds and builds and builds.
Not only is he good, sorry if I'm cutting you off, but
where you really see how good Nolan is at creating these big set pieces because it builds and builds and builds.
Not only is he good, sorry if I'm cutting you off, but the visionary, because there's talk about when they walk into that stadium and he's got these ideas. He even says he walked in and there's all these jaws dropped, dumbfounded looks of okay, well, how are we going to do any of this shit?
But it works so well. And it's such a great moment in the film. And it's it goes from you've got the mayor, his suite blows up, which is shocking. But then, and something's going on and you just start seeing explosions and the way that he cuts between them. Of course, the big moment is the field itself sort of imploding while the football team is on it. But then you see manholes bursting, in the street as John Blake's running through the streets. And then you get that in the street as John Blake's running through the streets. And then you get that giant overview of Gotham and explosions going off everywhere. And then the image of the bridges exploding. Yeah. It's just a really outstanding sequence.
Because
really,
it's so
really
far,
well done.
it's so far back, out of context, you'd be like, oh wow, this is a, beautiful cityscape. And then you see something happen to the bridge in the back.
Yeah.
Is that? And then it happens to the bridge that's in the
and
foreground. And you're like, oh,
an IMAX screen.
Yeah.
Really has impact because you're able to look here and there. And, because as we mentioned last episode, when you're looking at IMAX, you're not able to visualize everything at once. So a little bit of movement out of one corner is going to catch your eye and you look over there. Then you look at this other area of the screen where you see another bit of movement and it's another bridge blowing up. Yeah. And he's using the entire image in a way that you can't normally do.
Well, and he's just upping the ante. Like you have to in sequels, I guess, but like by the time it gets to this one, now you're in disaster movie, like war movie territory. Yeah. Like you're the armies of cops versus thugs that are like running. There's literally like thousands of people like running towards each other in this thing. I saw one thing with the stunt man talking about that is like, even in that moment where like a cop gets shot or whatever, and he falls over and he's like, seems like a simple stunt, right? No, there's 1,000 people behind you running at full speed. So you have to work to make sure those people aren't just going to trample
that guy and kill him. Yes. Yeah. So after wrapping in Pittsburgh, they moved to Los Angeles, New York. They actually used Trump Tower from Wayne Enterprises in this one, which is gross. And then New Jersey, Glasgow, Nottingham, and Wales. So they're shooting this literally all over the world. There were, you mentioned that how good the stuntmen are in this, Gary. There were a few in Nottingham and Wales. So they're shooting this literally all over the world. There were, you mentioned that how good the stuntmen are in this, Gary. There were a few injuries, a few accidents on the film. In Scotland, when they were shooting in Glasgow, a stuntman was doing a parachuting stunt and crashed through the roof of a house and got stuck.
Now he wasn't him just hanging there like, Dark Knight Rises in theaters, June 2012.
He didn't get seriously hurt, which is good. And then, there were more than just these two incidents, but in another one, Anne Hathaway's stunt double, who's named Jolene Van Vogt. I'm probably fucking that close up, but she was specifically her motorcycle stunt double. She rode the motor.
She's like one of those crazy motorcyclists. She was the first woman to do like the reverse 360 on a motorcycle. I'm trying to think of what those events are called. Your brother's
the circus. And there's a scene where she has to pilot it down a set of stairs, and she crashed it into an IMAX camera, which, as we know, are like $70,000 a piece.
These fools can't help but wreck an IMAX.
They got to wreck at least. I think they broke like 4 of them on this movie.
Jeez. It's crazy because I mean, it's Nolan's commitment to like doing these things physically. Like even the things they couldn't do that they wanted to do. Would they break into applied sciences up at the top in like Bane's place? They're legitimately dropping. It's a 1/3 scale Batmobile through
it's still pretty big.
Yeah, but it's still pretty big. Yeah. That's legit. It's all dropping through there like onto the floor. And so you got to plan for, I don't know. It's just, it's crazy. The amount of the effects and the stunt crew, what they do in these movies. It's crazy.
So what I think the most unique visuals in the film design wise is Bane's design. I mean, obviously you had to get the mask right. It's very different from the character's comic book world. So costume designer Lindy Hemming, she wanted this costume to look like it was kind of cobbled together from pieces of all the remote places that he had lived and traveled. So for example, parts of his vest are made from fragments of an old military tent. And then his clothes, Hemmings kind of explains them as, he says they're militaristic, but not in any way a uniform. And then combined with his coat, which Hemming actually personally designed, and she says that it took her 2 years.
I saw complete. That. Crazy.
It's that coat has equal parts. It looks equal parts dictatorial and revolutionary.
And this is kind of way off, but as I was watching it, I was paying closer attention to the look of Bane. And do you know who made me think of? Clarence Bodiger from RoboCop.
Okay, yeah.
If you look at he doesn't look
that
like
long
a street
coat
gang. Yeah, he's got that long coat, so he looks more like a revolutionary.
Well,
like
they designed the coat partially on, I think it was the Swiss Army wears really long coats like that, and it's made of like a lamb's hide that's really difficult to work with apparently, and they had a hard time finding seamstresses like in Los Angeles who could actually work with it.
Yeah.
So for the mask, that she wanted it to kind of look animalistic, like and it does. I mean, it really does.
Yeah.
So they said that like Nolan and her were like on the same page, animalistic. He had this idea for like a gorilla or a baboon burying its teeth, and she liked. She was looking at like tarantulas and stuff like that. She wanted like mandible, like something in to do with that.
It kind of fall somewhere in between those.
Yeah. They kind of modeled it there. What they ended up doing, she said, is they finally decide, okay, but what's practical? Like this guy's in a prison, so he's getting like what's the likely scenario? We got some like old mechanic that built this thing for like Nolan and her were like on the same page, animalistic. He had this idea for like a gorilla or a baboon burying its teeth, and she was looking at like tarantulas and stuff like that. She would have like mandible, like something in to do with that.
It kind of falls somewhere in between those.
Yeah. They kind of modeled it there. What they ended up doing, she said, is they finally decide, okay, but what's practical? Like this guy's in a prison, so he's getting like, what's the likely scenario? He got some like old mechanic that built this thing for him, and they're taking like bits of aircraft parts or something, and like that kind of thing, and that kind of molded it into what it was.
Nolan's concept for the mask was that basically it's giving him, whereas in the comics it's feeding him venom, which is his like strength, the thing that gives him his strength. But that's not part of his story in this at all. But in this, Nolan wanted it to be like he's getting like an anesthetic sort of, that gives him, that takes away just enough. Because
it's not that they didn't try, by the way. Like there's some footage you can find or drawings you can find of like all of the they ran through like a shit ton of mask designs,
a bunch of them.
And there are some that are close to the comic. I mean, there are some that go for like a full face covering and then just the device on it and that sort of thing. So they were looking at it, but they just decided what would be more practical. And then some of it I saw they were discussing with Hardy that, what do you need to make this work for you if you've got to wear a mask? And his thing was the eyes, that if he could have enough of his eyes to like really emphasize what he was doing, that it would work. And God bless him. They said he was super patient the whole time because this mask was super fitting, like gripping his face.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, what they did, so costume effects supervisor Graham Churchyard, he created a 3D model of Hardy's face and his face, his entire skull, basically, so that they could design the mask.
So he also had lifts in his shoes, just in case anybody's wondering.
So the film introduces a whole
and
new
I noticed
vehicle.
they shot him from really low angles most of the time.
Yeah, I mean, he's
just throwing that in.
They do a good job. I mean, they just needed him to look as an imposing force as they could. I mean, obviously they do what you're talking about, some thuds when he's walking, and they get like they work to make him seem heavy and mean and menacing, including in his fighting style, which we can talk about in a minute. But I also want to point out that Catwoman's suit, they could have gone with super sexy latex stitched together, but they went with like practical. Mostly, like, I mean, it's just like, I mean, like we talked about the goggles earlier, but like just a regular dark suit that's not unlike Batman's. It could like be
and not on what a cat burglar might want to wear,
Yeah,
right. And her boots are amazing. Like, you don't get to see them as up close, except for like the time she uses them, like on the one guy where he's like, "Does it hurt to walk in heels?" And but those boots have like a knife on the heel, like it's a straight up like blade on one side, and it's I forget the word I'm trying to find, but
it's a puncture on the tip.
Yeah, it's got a puncture on the tip. Yeah, it's just serrated. Like serrated. That's the word I was trying to think of. But yeah, serrated on the inside of the heel. Like it's kind of cool. So it seems like a perfectly, as much as heels could be, like a practical, like she's got a reason they exist.
Right. Yeah. Which is kind of Nolan's whole thing, is like everything needs to have a practical purpose.
I also love just in general, not to spend all day on this, but like that her design of her outfits are even that way. Like just her regular outfits, like the way she goes from like maid uniform to like it becomes an elegant dress, so that she fits in from place to place. She becomes like this, 1 second she's Audrey Hepburn, but she's really like James Bond. Like she just like switches in and out, and it's I don't know. It's just kind of
function.
There you go.
Yeah. Whereas we've seen the Bat costume develop, and then out of necessity, like, hey, he's got to be able to turn his head, so they made the changes there, and then Bane's costume, cobbled together from a bunch of different things, and then for her, it's she needs to be able to strip away a few pieces and look like a completely different person. So they designed it appropriately. Looks great.
So this film introduces a whole new vehicle to Batman's arsenal as well, which is just called the Bat. Nolan was like, I tried to think of different names for it that would like be the Bat combined with something that flies, like the Batcopter or whatever. But he's just like, bats fly, so it's just the Bat. So Nathan Crowley, once again, designed it. He approached the design as if it were an actual military project. They wanted it to and it is based on like a dual bladed helicopter, but they wanted it to fit in the same. So Nathan Crowley, once again, designed it. He approached the design as if it were an actual military project. They wanted it to and it is based on like a dual bladed helicopter, but they wanted it to fit in the same family that as like the Tumbler and the Bat Pod. They wanted it to look like it was made for the same purpose by the same people, because in the reality of the film, it is.
I say they should just go with the Bat Chopper.
The Bat Chopper, but it's not really a chopper. It's not. I mean,
no, I meant like that. Like I think in the old cartoon, he had like an actual helicopter.
Oh yeah.
Maybe on the old show or something.
So its size and shape proved pretty difficult considering Nolan's desire to use practical effects over CGI. And this kind of blew my mind, but a lot of the scenes of the Bat are not computer generated, at least not fully, but they are instead a model that was not a full-size model necessarily every time, but a model supported by wires, and they would suspend them from cranes or helicopters. Instead, a model that was not a full-size model necessarily every time, but a model supported by wires, and they would suspend them from cranes or helicopters or mount them onto vehicles with hydraulic controls to kind of create the movement. Now, they would sometimes supplement that with CGI, but it's primarily practical, which is wild.
You don't even notice it in the times that it is CGI. I mean, they really did, like you said, they're hanging it from helicopters moving through to get some footage. I mean, they legitimately, besides Crowley, by the way, who was hanging out with Christopher Nolan, if just so we complete this circle too. Yes, they started in the garage,
of course,
all of the designs with this.
But how big is Nolan's garage?
I don't know. But this guy, I saw something that had like footage of like the bat cave that he built and like all of this stuff. For like the big guys that work with Crowley on this, and they designed all of these amazing things. They were like, the one thing we couldn't get it to do was actually fly. And honestly, if we could have, we'd be much richer men than we are right now. We sold this off to the military. Yeah. These rigs, it's not just like a crane, like swinging it around. They had the thing going like 600 feet down a street. Yeah. They had this thing working, and it's just, I don't know. And then the truck they had it mounted on was like a gimbal. And then the thing is there, they just phase out the truck. But it's amazing to watch because it's just like going along. It can actually move and bank the aircraft like on top of it. And inside, no lie, there's like
an animatronic Bruce.
Yeah, there's a fully articulated animatronic Batman inside who turns
you
his
never
head
see in the movie.
Yeah. He turns his head, he looks around, he presses the controls. The Johnson modification for a weed whacker, where they like can replace different types of blades on the weed whacker. And they run it through, and so they'll get like jet engine sounds, and then this weird weed whacker stuff. They even take some like animal sounds and like just for the sound effects for the bat. It's just I don't know. It's just fascinating stuff they did here.
And it's cool as shit. I mean, it's really awesome.
So we mentioned earlier that Hans Zimmer returned again on this one, but I think he does a lot of the same. He does Batman's theme very similarly, and it pops up a lot more in this one than in the Dark Knight, probably because there's so many kind of heroic Batman's back moments kind of thing in this one.
I will say for him though that like early Batman stuff, when it shows him, I mean, it's definitely a more ethereal, I guess that would be the word for it, sound. Like it's
more
somber. There's no brass, like we talked about even with Harvey, the evolution of that. Like it's a ghostly version of the Bat.
Spot on. Because it does feel very haunting.
One of the coolest parts of the score in this one that he introduced is that chant, the Deshi Basara chant. Yeah. So this is a when I was reading up on it, nobody could tell what language it is, but they were trying to think of like a chant to have people do in this movie. And Christopher Nolan like texted Hans Zimmer these words, Deshi Basara, and Nolan was never able to fully figure out what language it was, but he was told that it meant the rise. Or to rise.
Yeah, I was about to say I saw that, or like rise.
And so they decided to use this, and it's very effective in the film, I think. But the way Zimmer got it on tape for the film, so he wanted thousands of voices on the soundtrack. He didn't just want like a few people in a studio. He wanted like literally thousands of voices on this. So he actually crowdsourced the internet to get it. He went on Twitter and he posted of voices on the soundtrack. He didn't just want like a few people in a studio. He wanted like literally thousands of voices on this. So he actually crowdsourced the internet to get it. He went on Twitter and he posted a link to this website where users could go on and submit themselves chanting. Which, of course, as soon as he posted it, it crashed the website servers. They had to get it back going again. But they got thousands and thousands of submissions to where, like, he says that there are tens of thousands of voices on this. And a lot of those are just people who went on Twitter and clicked on this link and submitted their voices doing this chant, which I think is really cool for a fan to be able to watch the movie and going like, yeah, okay, my voice is in there. It's with 10,000 other voices, but that's kind of a cool thing to be a part of a movie.
Yeah, it's fun to see. Like, Hans Zimmer has become like one of my favorite people just because of these movies, but just to see him talk about some of the stuff where he says, you know, after the last movie, he didn't think there was anything left for them to do, but he felt they wanted it to sound like a ritual, like even with the escape from the pit and that sort of thing. So it's in like 5/4 time. So it gets this like sense of urgency, but then he gets the orchestra involved and he's just like, just play, just like, but like attack your instruments, you know, just like you could hit a note that's within a certain range, but like you're really just kind of attacking the instruments. He describes it as like, we took, you know, and obviously he's Hans Zimmer, so he would think this. He says, we took the greatest achievement of Western civilization, and then we just reduced it back down to tribalism, like this thing. And so they started having them just like hit their stuff, like just bang on your instruments, and just to go with the rhythm of the whole thing. And I just thought that was amazing. He just sounds like he's having a blast.
He is, yeah. So The Dark Knight Rises was released on July 20th, 2012. And we have to, I think, address one major news item that's related to this. I think it would be a gunman comes in wearing a gas mask and he opens fire inside of a theater. Killed 12 people, injured 58 other people. The police apprehended him. He was hanging out like by his car outside of the theater. It was a 24-year-old by the name of James Egan Holmes. It was later found. He told the police, he's like, my booby trapped my apartment as well. And they found a bunch of explosives there, which were dismantled by a bomb squad the next day. And he went to trial. He initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, but he was eventually convicted. He was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences plus 3,318 years without parole.
Jesus.
And a lot of people they associated him. You know, there were these rumors that he was obsessed with the Joker and things like that, all of which ended up being unsubstantiated. It turned out in the end that the most likely reason that he chose this particular theater, the Joker and things like that, all of which ended up being unsubstantiated. It turned out in the end that the most likely reason that he chose this particular theater was because he knew it would be crowded, because he knew there would be a lot of people in there.
Yeah.
And because there was, you know, after police started investigating him afterwards, there were clear signs that he was mentally ill and that he had hinted that he was going to do something violent. It had nothing to do with Batman or the movie, or which is what a lot of people tried to pin it on at the time. But it became clear that, yeah, he knew that this movie was going to be a big hit. If he goes, it's a midnight screening of it is going to be almost completely full, if not completely full. So that's why he chose it, which sucks.
Yeah.
As a result of the shooting, Warner Brothers did cancel its premieres for the film in Paris, Mexico, and Japan. They called them off completely, and they pulled a lot of the like TV ads and things like that for the next few weeks afterwards. There was also speculation that knew that this movie was going to be a big hit. If he goes, it's a midnight screening of it is going to be almost completely full, if not completely full. So that's why he chose it, which sucks.
Yeah.
As a result of the shooting, Warner Brothers did cancel its premieres for the film in Paris, Mexico, and Japan. They called them off completely, and they pulled a lot of the like TV ads and things like that for the next few weeks afterwards. There was also speculation that was going to hurt the film's box office numbers, but that turned out to not be the case. There were some early screenings that were a little bit lower, but the movie still earned $448 million in North America alone, earned over $1 billion worldwide. It actually was the second highest grossing film of the year behind The Avengers. and the highest grossing film in the Dark Knight trilogy. This made more money than the Dark Knight did.
Wow.
In addition to its box office success, it also received, it's funny because I remember this receiving like mixed reviews, but if you go back and look at it, it received almost not unanimously, but like the Dark Knight did. Although Anne Hathaway did get nominated for Favorite Female Butt Kicker Award at the 2013 Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards.
Nice.
So there's that. She lost.
Nominated but didn't win.
No, she lost to Kristen Stewart for Snow White and the Huntsman.
Man.
Who also beat out Scarlett Johansson as Black Widow in the Avengers and Jennifer Lawrence as Katniss in the first Hunger Games. Just proving that kids are fucking stupid.
Well, this is, I feel worse for Nolan because I think this was his first movie, like maybe since Insomnia, that hadn't like received some kind of Academy Awards attention.
I don't feel bad for Christopher Nolan. He's doing fine.
No. Well, I mean, I bet that, sarcastically, he is okay. And, it's too bad that this one didn't, but I don't really, we kind of talked about the Academy Awards in the last one, just they were still on their way to even thinking about movies like this.
Sure.
In advance.
Yeah, it was wild.
And so this is, when you think like something, I wouldn't say that it was as impactful culturally as like say 89's Batman, where the logo was on everything. It was certainly a big deal by the time this movie rolled around. Speaking of reviews, Justin, one thing that would, normally we wait till the end of the show, but now would be a perfect time to mention that some reviewers that, God help us all, hopefully don't get ranked on Rotten Tomatoes, did not have a good time with this movie. And so here would be the perfect time to tell you that somebody needs a nap. All right. First up, we've got Madison Wood, and his or her subject line, their subject line says, "How does Bane eat? Does he have a feet?" Watching it, my brain is immediately wiped, and I remember almost nothing about it other than how good Cillian Murphy looks when he randomly shows up near the end. Tom Hardy's impossibly jacked body looks good in that one scene where he's shirtless in the cave or whatever. But seriously, if Chris Nolan covers his beautiful face in any more films, I'm going to file a lawsuit. Definitely not my fave Tom Hardy film. Glad it helped Tom Hardy's career, but my God, they made him look big in this movie. And for what? So he could kick Batman's ass? So he could put his hand on a shorter man's shoulder and say, "Do you feel in charge?" Okay, yeah. Granted, that scene is pretty hot, but Tom Hardy is 5'9", and this movie would not have me believe that he's like 6'11". That is the review from Madison.
She was horny on Maine there.
Wow.
This is from Demon Cycler. Avengers rocked. This movie socked.
What?
Demon Cycler. Avengers rocked. This movie socked.
What? That even mean?
SOCKED or SUCK?
SOCKED.
Okay.
Socked. Gotcha.
Too long. What? 2 hour, 45-minute movie? The villain was terrible. Anne Hathaway embarrassed Catwomen everywhere, and Alfred was a little whiny bitch. Nothing fun about this movie. Trout have more soul than this Batman. A trout is a fish, for those of you apathetic morons reading this review. So breathe in the bat fart, Gotham. You've earned it. This movie was almost as good as Steel. However, you might say Shaq's acting was superb in comparison. This movie was only slightly better than, nope, can't think of a worse movie. Compared to this movie, Son of Mask kicked ass. Even John Ritter was a better hero at large. By the way, kicked ass. Even John Ritter was a better hero at large. By the way, do you guano-chomping movie review readers realize that idiot humans are causing the demise of Chiropetra? What? Stop spelunking. You are spreading disease and killing off all of the bats. Bats are crucial in the maintenance of a healthy ecosystem.
What the fuck? Guy. Oh, my God.
That went off the rails really quick.
Wow.
I'm going to do one more if I can real quick. This is too long, pointless, and completely fake characters and plot. This is from Carl Brown. He said, my son wanted to watch this, so I did. What motivates Bane to destroy a city with 10 million residents? That's really the question that you ought to answer when you consider this movie. Is it greed, revenge, lust, class envy? Much to my surprise, it was for the love of a little girl.
Oh, whoa.
Because so many of us grown men decide to become homicidal maniacs because so many of us grown men decide to become homicidal maniacs because we want to protect little girls. Somebody flag this. Besides the unexplained fact that Bane has superhuman strength, besides the silly unanswered how does Bane eat with a mask on his face, besides all these things, the whole plot and whole reason for tension is the ridiculous notion that the guy is motivated to destroy an entire city because he wants to protect this little girl. So why do I give this just 1 star? Because the whole world that Bruce Wayne lives in is fake. The characters are fake, especially Bane. And the message is that if you care about a little girl and things don't go your way, you might become a homicidal maniac. Right. All the more reason I don't like this. The movie blurs right from wrong. Was Bane a good guy to care about a little girl? Was the girl good when she loved Bruce Wayne? Was Catwoman good, or was she just stealing to pay her rent? Was it okay to trick the whole city into believing that Batman was the bad guy and Harvey Dent was the good guy? The whole good she loved Bruce Wayne. Was Catwoman good, or was she just stealing to pay her rent? Was it okay to trick the whole city into believing that Batman was the bad guy and Harvey Dent was the good guy? The whole good part of this movie is without thinking deeply about it. The casual moviegoer will leave thinking that class envy was the root of Bane's rage and that class envy only leads in destruction. One person found this review helpful.
Well, the thing here's the thing about that one, Gary, is that she made, I think it was a she, I can't remember, but
it was Carl.
Carl actually made some valid points there towards the end, based on, but they were saying that, like, the film's confusion between, I think they thought the film was confused about what was right and wrong, but I think that's actually partially, or at least mostly, intentional. You know, like I think that they're saying that like it's a bad thing, but it's intentional. Although the question about whether that makes a good segue to a point that I wanted to make, and I'm going to preface this by saying that I like this movie and I think it's very entertaining. I think it's a very fitting conclusion to Batman's story, but it is not, and I don't think anyone would argue that it is, but it's not the masterpiece that The Dark Knight was, the previous film was. It is not, and it would be hard for any film to reach those heights because that film has, its centerpiece is what will be forever considered a legendary performance by Heath Ledger.
Right.
I think it was a wise move to make a villain as different from the Joker as you could, and I think Tom Hardy does a great job. I think he's really good. I even love his weird voice, as we discussed earlier. But it is a strange movie, and it's a bit of a confused movie, I think. At nearly 3 hours long, which I don't normally necessarily mind this one being 3 hours long, but it oddly feels bloated, but also kind of rushed at the same time. The sense of time in this movie doesn't quite work. Like, how long is Bruce in that prison?
Right.
You know, you never really feel the sense of how long he's there because it's long enough for Bane to completely take over Gotham and seemingly long enough for Bruce's spine to fucking fuse back together. Like, how long has he been in there? For years? But I think it's only supposed to be a matter of a couple of months. Yeah. But you never really get a sense of how long it's supposed to be. And it kind of, and that lack of a sense of time kind of throws a lot of the second half of the film off because it feels like they're very rushed to hit different plot points to get to the conclusion. It almost feels like there is a 6-hour version of this movie out there, that this was actually, they had enough material for 2 movies that they crammed into one long movie instead. And I kind of
saw somewhere that it was like 5 months in the pit.
Yeah.
I kind of saw somewhere that it was like 5 months in the pit.
Which is still not, I'm sorry, not long enough for not being in a hospital for Bruce Wayne's spine that was protruding from his back that gets punched back into him by an old man to fuse back together without the aid of a hospital. It's weird saying that's implausible because it's a fucking comic book movie, but it's a comic book movie that pretends to be realistic.
Right. Well, when that's your stated goal,
right,
being as realistic as possible, and that was one of Kat's big complaints about this movie is she gets really lost in the passage of time. She goes, it's, at one point it's, everything's fine, and then there's snow, like snow didn't fall, it just crashed to the ground, and now it's winter. So it's tough to keep track, and that can be very jarring.
It never feels like you're spending months, and they have a lot of big ideas in their brains. Watch just a single episode of Westworld for proof, which is Jonathan Nolan's show. But even at 2 hours and 45 minutes, you don't really have enough time to address them all of the ideas that they're trying to introduce, and also deliver a thrilling action movie that propels itself forward. And that sort of brings in where my biggest issue with the film, and it's, despite all of its big ideas, it's never really about anything, because it doesn't take a side on anything. It pays lip service to some pretty big ideas. The biggest one being probably the idea of this wealth gap that's been created in Gotham. Like, without the mob there, the gap between the haves and the have-nots is very obvious. And it never really explores it. You get the idea that gap between the haves and the have-nots is very obvious. And it never really explores it. You get the idea that, like, Bane's plan, his big idea hinges on the fact that the poor of Gotham, the poor people in Gotham, have been so oppressed that they're willing to rise up and fight the rich because of the way that they've been kind of trodden upon by the rich people in Gotham. But you never really see that. You don't see any of this through the eyes of a regular Gothamite. So you never really get the sense that that's the case, other than a couple of lines of dialogue here and there. I mean, the biggest kind of rich guy villain that you get in the movie is Ben Mendelsohn's character, who is very good in the role, by the way. I love Ben Mendelsohn, but his plot is just one rich guy kind of being an asshole to another rich guy. So it doesn't really fit within that theme,
Yeah.
You get like a one line of dialogue that mentions that some of Gotham's homeless people are joining Bane's army, going down to the sewers, because you get like a one line of dialogue that mentions that some of Gotham's homeless people are joining Bane's army, going down to the sewers because there's work to be found there. But that's really all you get. You don't really see them going through in any of the poor people in Gotham going through any kind of suffering. You don't really get a sense that they feel like they've been oppressed, which is kind of Bane's entire plan is based on that. You get Bane, he attacks the stock exchange. He's not in it for money. He's not really out to help the oppressed of Gotham. That's all kind of a facade to facilitate his whole League of Shadows plan, which is to blow Gotham up, basically.
Yeah, he's not really ever concerned with that. And I think most of what you're saying, I mean, wouldn't even stand out if it wasn't like a Christopher Nolan movie where he's so, like, I don't know, like, concerned with being realistic about the whole thing.
Well, and because The Dark Knight was so thematically rich, that this movie's themes feeling so muddled feels like a misstep, especially as a follow-up.
Yeah, I felt like in The Dark Knight, he was like trying to make a lot of statements, but didn't really pick a side necessarily either.
Yeah.
But yeah, I could see, I mean, we're being told, like, coming back into this is a rich and vibrant Gotham as opposed to what it had been, like, or at least, I mean, Joseph Gordon-Levitt's character is like talking about, pretty soon we're just going to have to be chasing down overdue library books because, like, crime's so low, I guess. But
well, that's the thing. That's another weird thing that the movie does, is that it tells you that the reduction in crime in Gotham is based on this lie that Harvey Dent was a hero, right? Mm-hmm. And how does the movie end? With another lie, that Batman has sacrificed himself. So Batman learns the lesson that, this lie, we're going to fix it by telling another giant lie. And so the movie, like, what the hell is the movie trying to say there? I think it's very confused about what it's trying to say with that.
Yeah, that one didn't stand out as much to me, but I mean, I guess I see what you're saying, but I mean, Batman is dead technically, either way you look at it at the end of this movie.
Sure. So, yeah. I mean, the character, but he still lives as a symbol, which is Bruce's whole thing, but how long is that going to last? Obviously, even the movie thinks that it's not going to last too long because the movie ends with us seeing the next guy who's going to be Batman, So even the movie knows that it's on shaky ground.
Well, and I think he even sees, like, with the kids, like, drawing the symbols everywhere and stuff, that it's realized it's about more than just Bruce. Hopefully, I mean, I think that's what they're trying to say.
Yeah, but I mean, the movie it sits in some weird places because I think you could have thrown in some scenes where you see how regular Gothamites are.
And I think that's what they're trying to say.
Yeah, but I mean, the movie it sits in some weird places because I think you could have thrown in some scenes where you see how regular Gothamites are reacting to Bane. All of a sudden, there's this time jump, and they're just all of a sudden they're part of the revolution, but you never see why or how they're reacting to that. Like, that's kind of a big deal. And I think you don't ever see how they were living before he came to town that would cause them to want to join this madman's revolution.
Outside of Batman Begins.
You see the Narrows a little bit.
Right.
Yeah, but you don't see that in this movie at all. And I don't think you see enough of it in Batman Begins.
Well, I guess I just missed completely that, like, the regular day-to-day Gothamite were the people joining Bane. I know, like, a lot of them were criminals, and, like, the people that had been locked away, like, they
later on,
once
the prison people have been let out, then they join. But before that,
they haven't received any funding for the places. They're having to kick them out on the street. They've got no place else to go. So that seems pretty standard to me, that, like, where are you going to end up? Whoever offers you a place to be and a place to belong.
Right. But I just feel like there's not enough to show why they would be, because the thing that I'm saying is that Bane's whole, like, speech that he gives, which of course we find out is nothing but bullshit anyway. His whole speech is he's trying to empower people to rise up above the oppression that they've been living under, but we never see that oppression.
Yeah.
It's never shown to the audience. It's never related to the audience.
Guess I don't think that I ever really saw anybody rise up either. You know what I mean? Like,
I mean, Bane has
except
a whole
the
army.
criminals that had been abused by the Dent Act. But Bane had an army, but he had the League of Shadows, which existed before and after. Like, I mean,
but the movie makes a point of his army being filled with
I don't feel like you have to make much sense out of that.
Yeah, because keep in mind, this was also coming around shortly after the Occupy Wall Street movement.
So it was a lot. They shot during, like, Christopher Nolan actually considered taking cameras down to Wall Street and shooting scenes during Occupy Wall Street.
So
don't get me wrong, it's a lot of
the 99. So it's a lot of 99% versus 1%.
Sure.
Like, we get the scenes of them going into the high dollar apartment buildings and, destroying things and throwing the 1% out on the street. So, I mean,
so it's clearly about class.
Yeah, I think I would say that there's definitely a statement to be made there, or, like, that's what he's trying to say, and one of the themes of the movie. I just don't feel like I ever saw him picking which side Gotham ended up on. Like, Gotham it felt like Gotham was in that football stadium, and then they just kind of locked themselves away. They never did anything. Maybe the homeless people, sure, but that was an easier one to explain. Like, it's like, where do these homeless kids with their wayward teens with nowhere else to go, these people take them in? It's the foot, man. That's what they do.
Well, the Occupy Wall Street thing is another kind of weird gray area where this movie sits kind of politically, because it acts like it's trying to make a statement, but never really is clear on the side it's taking. It almost feels like, on one hand, the most clearly states that, like, Nolan's kind of on the side of the occupiers being the bad guys, because that's what he creates in the film. Bane is the people working for Bane are the 1%. So they're the people who would be the protesters, the Occupy Wall Street protesters. And Nolan paints them as the bad guy. And as we've kind of mentioned before, Nolan is fairly conservative, it seems, in his political views. But then he also kind of makes the Wall Street guys kind of sin. Nolan paints them as the bad guy. And as we've kind of mentioned before, Nolan is fairly conservative, it seems, in his political views. But then he also kind of makes the Wall Street guys kind of seem like assholes too. Like, he, when you see them on the stock exchange, they're kind of dicks too.
Yeah, I would say that Nolan's pretty conservative as a filmmaker. Like he probably has a conservative lean politically. I think his big thing is the more typical government, like big government is not a good idea thing. Like
I think I don't know Christopher Nolan's political affiliation, but I'm going to say he's a libertarian based on what I see in his movies, based on kind of what you're saying.
Yeah.
Because this movie does kind of show that as well. And a lot of what the movie is showing is how these institutions ultimately fail the individual. Which is a very kind of libertarian lean. Sure. Even the League of Shadows even is a these institutions ultimately fail the individual, which is a very kind of libertarian lean. Sure. Even the League of Shadows even is a group of fanatics. They end up being kind of useless. Gotham Police Department in this film is pretty corrupt, especially in Batman Begins, but by this one they're basically totally ineffectual. I mean, look at the scene where they're chasing Bane, where after the stock exchange takeover, they decide to go after Batman instead of after the criminal. So the Gotham Police Department is kind of a bunch of bumbling doofuses.
That's throughout this movie. Like it all can be turned against you. I mean, there's a theme with
even
like
Wayne
power.
Enterprises is a failure.
Well, Batman, I mean, is a failure. Like he's got all this military might behind himself, and there's a price that comes with that. You can wield all of this might and all of this technology, but Batmobiles that these people are using, and it's all of the shit from Allied technology or whatever that he's got to go up against at the end. So it's you've got the power of an army here, and he's always concerned about turning it over. And it's like then it ends up in the wrong hands anyway.
Right.
So that's where I would come to that conclusion.
Well, and also John Blake's story arc is basically about a good guy, a good cop, maybe one of the few good cops, who's so frustrated by the system and by the failures and stupidity of the system that his only option is to leave the system behind and become Batman, to work outside of the system on his own as an individual.
Yeah. I mean, that's 100% true.
And of course, there's also one of the film's most like triumphant moments concerns an army of police officers in their blues beating up a bunch of people in the streets, and it's played as a very beating up a bunch of people in the streets, and it's played as a very heroic moment.
Well, to be fair, they are murdering people and blowing things up.
They should, yeah.
I mean, they're terrorists essentially.
Well, but what I'm saying is the movie is very like confused. Not confused. It doesn't. It's not really about anything. That's the thing. Is like it acts. It has all these ideas, and it makes you think that it's making a statement. But in the end, when you really think about it, it doesn't really have a whole lot to say.
Yeah, I just don't think it lands on anything. It's the same problem that the Dark Knight had. Like it doesn't make a decision. It's the same idea with like Batman having this, Homeland Security style reach, or what was it called? The Patriot Act style reach. And the Dark Knight Rises, he uses it to get what he needs done. And he's like, you got to destroy it because it can't end up in the wrong hands. What's the same shit he's dealing with here? What's the same shit he's dealing with here?
Yeah.
It's like, I got all this stuff and it shouldn't end up in the wrong hands. Well, it does end up in the wrong hands. And yes, it causes a huge problem. I mean, this big thing that he probably should have flooded the fucking room in the first place, I guess, but he kept it around and then it got turned against him. And so maybe,
which is also kind of a weird anti-green energy statement that the movie's making, that this, what should be a clean energy device is turned into, a weapon that can kill millions of people, which is also kind of a weird stance that the movie's seemingly making.
I'm not going to say that as much thought Christopher Nolan puts into things that he wasn't thinking that seems like a reach to me, but who knows? Maybe that's what he was thinking.
Okay.
But he also seems like he just drops things in. Like, sorry, Todd, I'll let you go. But the fact that Blake is fucking named Robin at the end, that's just stupid. Like for the sake of it happening.
All right. So here's we've gone through this whole series, and I usually end up being the voice of the contrary. here. So I'm going to put out a very bold statement. You guys know that I'm a big Batman fan from the word go.
Batman's a pedophile. I already know what you're going to say, Todd.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. You beat me to the punch.
Really close. He's way too close with Robin.
Yeah. No, but here's my big statement here. People need to stop watching Dark Knight. Here's why. Gary, you went either last episode or the first episode and saying this is full of great performances. And Justin, on more than one occasion, you've said that this is Bruce Wayne's story. Dark Knight is so focused on Joker that I think to get a real clear father comes to take him out with the question, why do we fall? The prison that he has to rise up out of is very much the well. That while he's down there, he's confronted with the image of his surrogate father, Ra's al Ghul. He is having to face his fear again. His journey in Batman Begins is from one of Bruce Wayne to Batman, from man to symbol. In Dark Knight Rises, he is the symbol. That's what's destroyed his life and eventually becomes the catalyst of his city on the brink. It's only him becoming Bruce again and making these decisions to give up being this symbol. And yes, it is perpetuated on this lie, but that's because he's having to face himself. And when I'm to symbol in Dark Knight Rises, he is the symbol. That's what's destroyed his life and eventually becomes the catalyst of his city on the brink. It's only him becoming Bruce again and making these decisions to give up being this symbol. And yes, it is perpetuated on this lie, but that's because he's having to face himself. And when I say face himself, think about all the villains in the Batman universe. They've all been reflections of him. They've all been reflections of Batman to some degree. In Bane, having Bane have this particular origin of being taken in by Ra's al Ghul and then excommunicated from the League of Shadows, Batman's not fighting some other villain. He's fighting a surrogate brother, someone who he could have very easily stood shoulder to shoulder with in a battle of this nature. So he is having to regain the fear of death to overcome these insurmountable odds. And that's what we're watching here. We were watching Bruce journey to becoming the symbol, and then we are watching him regain his humanity. And the way he does that is by setting that symbol aside and becoming the man that Alfred and ultimately his true father, Thomas Wayne, really wanted him to be. Thomas Wayne could have sat in a boardroom and raked in millions of dollars. He was a doctor. He got out there and he was his own man, and he let other people handle the company. That's what he wanted for Bruce. He wanted Bruce. It was his dying wish to him. Don't be afraid. But at the same time, have that fear of death so that you make the most of your life.
Right, which is
what Bruce of the Batman trilogy. No, listen to what I'm saying. This movie is about Bruce pulling himself out of the pit by his bootstraps.
Gary, listen to what I'm saying. If you want to watch great performances, by all means, watch Dark Knight. I do. There's times where I'll just be on a Dark Knight kick. But if you're looking for that cohesive, from beginning to end Batman story, Batman Begins.
I understand your sentiment, what you're saying, Todd, but I think that you're dismissing the Dark Knight as an integral part of that arc, because
so much of it gets rehashed. So much of it gets rehashed in Dark Knight Rises.
Then that's a flaw in the Dark Knight Rises. If it's rehashing the same information. That's of no fault to the Dark Knight. The Dark Knight came around first. So
I think the Dark Knight introduces like some of the, I think what they're going for is it introduces some of the themes that they're going to tackle in Rises deeper, like a
symbol in Batman Begins. He truly becomes a symbol when he takes the fall for Harvey Dent at the end of The Dark Knight. That's an integral part of Bruce Wayne's story.
Yeah,
because that's the point where
feel
he's
like the arc
he's willing
works.
to. Yeah, I think you need the Dark Knight in there.
My big questions coming out of it were like, when the fuck did is the only time, like, these are the most streamlined Nolan movies, the most linear Nolan movies you can ask for, but was that scene of him in the cockpit of the Bat flying that bomb out over the bay, was that like in the past?
When did he eject?
Because when did he eject? There's no way he ejected like 5 seconds before and still lived. The thing had a 6-mile radius. Like, he's
and
toast.
Also maybe that was the animatronic. That they put it.
The animatronic Bruce.
My other big question is another, and I hate saying these negative things about this because I really do like that they put it.
The animatronic Bruce.
My other big question is another, and I hate saying these negative things about this because I really do like this movie. I like a lot about it, but it's. I would be remiss if I didn't point out the things that I think are flaws. Talia al Ghul's flip makes it's not earned. It is not earned.
It feels out.
It doesn't make any sense because she says that like because her father was an asshole and she's like she was rejected essentially by her father, and then she changes her mind when Batman lets Ra's al Ghul die. All of a sudden she wants to fulfill his legacy. That doesn't make, there's nothing that justifies that character arc at all.
Sure. This feels like the one thing that's like the bigger idea part that you mentioned earlier that they just didn't have time to really flesh out or something,
right?
Because you make it feel complete. Like he's, it's connected all the way back to the beginning, which I don't think you had to do considering this is more about Bruce and Batman and that sort of thing. And you still got the arc with or without the League of Shadows being a part of this ending.
Maybe it was a thing of like, she also had this affection for Bane because he protected her. So
yeah, which is fine, but she has a line of dialogue.
Ra's al Ghul, excommunicating Bane. So she wants to get revenge by surpassing her father's plan.
There's nothing in the text of the film that supports
that. There's nothing in there.
You can't just fanfic your way into
that's what I'm like.
It.
So I'm having to grasp at straws
fair,
here.
She's a little girl, so maybe what they meant. See, I don't know what it is with the pedophile thing this week, but it's.
You got a weird fixation on it, Gary. I'm
just saying, like maybe Ra's al Ghul rightfully was just like
weird fixation on it, Gary. I'm
just saying, like maybe Ra's al Ghul rightfully was just like, you like my daughter too much.
I'm also very curious how the guy who we see in the pit as Tom Hardy becomes the Bane that we see later. Like at what point did he acquire like that persona? It's very strange. It's they don't feel like the same character hardly at all.
Well, it doesn't make sense. Yeah, because he's just a dude who's been through a lot of shit, apparently, you assume, down in the pit, and he protects a little girl because he's worried about what's going to happen to her, and that all makes sense. But it's like
how
why
did you
does
become
that guy
Bane?
Yeah, why did that guy become a
not that I need an origin
terrorist?
Story. I don't need an origin story for Bane, but I need the two versions of that character to feel like they're the same person. And like if I didn't know what Tom Hardy's face looked like, what about that tells me?
Well, here's another big loophole. So we got to assume that
I think I've got
all of us
shitting on the movie now.
We got to assume that Bane was excommunicated.
Tells me.
Well, here's another big loophole. So we got to assume that
I think I've got
all of us
shitting on the movie now.
We got to assume that Bane was excommunicated before Bruce was there.
Well, yeah.
Or after. Yeah, I guess.
Or after, or in between.
So then why are we just now finding out about Bane like 8 years after the fact?
Yeah.
If he's been a revolutionary, like, wreaking havoc all around the world, like, what did that just not pop up on Bruce's radar?
I mean, if it wasn't an immediate threat to Gotham, it may not have.
Yeah,
because
I guess so.
he's not saving the world; he's saving Gotham.
Yeah, it is weird when you sit back and think about it. Just like, all right, so he joins the League of Shadows. Maybe that's where he got the mentality of the League of Shadows. Like, we've got to cleanse this whole place. But then it's like, well, what part of that got him excommunicated? Was it just because he was into the daughter? That's a little weird. So then the daughter leaves, but then she comes back to it and is like, and they're both indicated. Was it just because he was into the daughter? That's a little weird. So then the daughter leaves, but then she comes back to it and is like, and they're both just like, you know what, though? We still want to do what Roz had set in mind anyway, even though he didn't want us around. And so,
which doesn't make any, like, why would you care about his lofty goals if, Anyway, so we need to wrap this up, but I do want to mention a couple other things that I do like about the movie before we do, because one, I mentioned earlier that Christopher Nolan is really good at set pieces. Like we mentioned that one, but the opening with the airplane heist, like, is absolutely just incredible beginning to end. And then you've got one of my favorites is when Bane takes over that financial district. That whole sequence is just so well orchestrated and well constructed. It's really, really good because it goes from him taking over the financial district into the car chase where we get
we've been blowing this film the whole time. Like, this movie is a well-made film.
Yeah.
And I mean, the amount of trouble they go through for like practical effects and just how good everything looks. That scene, that battle at the end, real poor people, real cops. Like,
just let him loose.
And, so it's perfect.
I also love Anne Hathaway's Selena Kyle. We already said how much I love her performance, but I like the way that the character's handled in this movie.
Yeah.
I think it's the most humanized version of that of the Catwoman character we've ever seen in a film. And she, like many other characters, even in this film, Batman specifically, she has a kind of a redemption arc. Like, that's kind of her thing. She's not just a villain, and Catwoman never has been. That's one thing that's always been interesting about her, is because she's sort of almost the other side of the coin from Batman. Like, she's a burglar, but she's not a bad guy per se. She's just trying to get by, and this is what she's had to turn to. From Batman, like, she's a burglar, but she's not a bad guy per se. She's just trying to get by, and this is what she's had to turn to. But her inclusion in this film kind of helps to mirror some of the questions about Batman's own morality. Because what Batman is doing is, technically speaking, criminal. It is against the law to be a vigilante.
Yeah.
So is she really better than him? I think that's one thing that's always been very interesting about that character. And I think Anne Hathaway kills it, honestly. And we mentioned it before, but I fucking love Tom Hardy in this movie. I love his stupid voice. I love that stupid voice. And one thing I remember from when this movie was being released, so before this movie came out, there was before it was the latest Mission Impossible movie. I think it was Ghost Protocol. The latest Mission Impossible movie, they were showing in IMAX theater, so they were going to preview the opening 6 minutes of The Dark Knight Rises sequence, which was shot in IMAX. And I remember when it happened, there being all of this talk about Bane's voice, and people couldn't understand him. They didn't know what he was saying.
Yeah.
And it's ironic because Gary mentioned earlier how Christopher Nolan doesn't like ADR, but they replaced the dialogue in that scene. And the way that Bane's voice sounds in this entire movie feels separated from the character.
It does.
Like,
it almost has that. I kept thinking of Candyman.
It's too far forward in the mix, in the sound mix. It feels disassociated with everything else. But I actually found, I'm going to play this for you guys, a comparison between that original IMAX version and the finished version of the film. And it's not just a remix, it's a different take of the dialogue. I don't know if they re-recorded it or used a different take, but it is definitely not. I mean, you can hear the inflection in some of his lines, and it's not just a different mix of the same exact.
Before throwing him out of a plane. Or perhaps he's wondering why someone would shoot a man before throwing him out of a plane. It doesn't matter who we are. What matters is our plan. It doesn't matter who we are. What matters is our plan. No one cared who I was until I put on the mask. No one cared who I was till I put on the mask.
So you can tell those are not like the exact same.
Yeah.
And it really is. It, like, we know what he's saying in the IMAX version of that, but like, we know what he's saying because we already know the lines. Like, if you had heard that for the first time, and in fact, when I watched the movie this time, I watched it with subtitles on because I wanted to make sure I could understand Tom Hardy, because even with the better sound mix, his accent makes it kind of hard to understand what he's saying sometimes.
It's pretty insane.
Because even with the better sound mix, his accent makes it kind of hard to understand what he's saying sometimes.
It's pretty insane. Like, you could definitely tell a huge difference there. I will say on the worst takes or the early takes, he does sound more like Bartley or whatever.
He does, a little bit. Yeah, I agree. So anyway, what else do we have to say about this movie? We've been going on for a long time, but it's a 3-hour movie, so there's a lot to talk about.
Well, we're an in-depth podcast. People are going to walk out of these podcasts not needing to know another goddamn thing about Batman, The Dark Knight Rises. They're going to either by force or just they'll just be like, I don't want to hear another thing about The Dark Knight Rises. That's it. That's how I treat my whole week leading into these now. It's just like, I'm going to know everything I can, and I'm going to fucking hate this by the end of it.
I don't want to end this without saying how much I like Michael Caine in this movie.
Leading into these now. It's just like, I'm going to know everything I can, and I'm going to fucking hate this by the end of it.
I don't want to end this without saying how much I like Michael Caine in this movie as well.
Oh,
the moment at the gravesite,
I felt you.
Oh my God, it's heartbreaking. And of course, in the movie, it's like 2 minutes later, proves that everything is fine. But
that's Batman living long enough to really see himself become the villain. You make Alfred cry, you piece of shit,
you son of a bitch. Do you guys have anything else to add before we wrap it up?
No, I love it, man. I'm a Batman fan. It's any version of Batman. Do
you like Batman and Robin?
You know what? I get it, so I can endure it if I decide to sit
like Batman
and watch
and Robin. I don't think it's good, but I enjoy watching it.
Good. Yeah,
I enjoy watching it. It's incredibly entertaining.
How do you feel about Twilight Boy being Batman? I'm like, honestly.
First of all, if they're still calling him Twilight Boy after all the stuff he's done in between, they need some
He's more than
education
proven himself.
Sure.
Yes. Well, so if they watch the trailer, that is no longer a question because he was badass in that trailer.
Yeah.
And I'm
all that
excited
to say,
about it.
I'm down. If it's Batman, bring it on. Let's have a big day with it.
Yeah, I don't. Man, this movie, we nitpicked it there at the end, but it's still a really.
It's not a perfect film. Movie. It's not as tight as the previous films, but it's still pretty damn. It's still got a lot going for it.
I mean, just for the cinematography alone,
for the sheer scope,
fantastic
of it.
If this is the weakest entry,
you're doing pretty good.
That it's still better than most.
This is no Godfather 3.
Yeah, right.
All right, guys. Well, let's talk about what we're doing next week because it is going to be December.
Yeah,
it's beginning to look a lot like Christmas.
I've been hesitant to do a Christmas series because fucking Christmas movies are pretty bad most of the time, honestly. Yeah. And we've talked on our previous show about some kind of fun, what we called incidental Christmas movies and things like that. But we're gonna do a series that I think will be pretty fun that I think fans of our show will dig, and it's going to be called Black Christmas. Woo. And these are 4 films that we'll talk about through the month of December, set at Christmas, and are written by Mr. Shane Black.
Yeah.
Who, man, loves Christmas.
Yeah.
So not the initial Black Christmas that you might have been thinking of.
No, you thought it was going to be that horror movie. But I think we've talked about that before, too.
Yeah, back on the old show we did. That was Bob Clark. And he also did Porky's, which I rewatched the other day.
Yeah. He also did A Christmas Story.
Yeah. So good for that.
He also did A Christmas Story.
Yeah. So good for that guy. So maybe we'll have a Bob Clark. Well, that doesn't really make sense. I guess Black Christmas. Porky's is not a Christmas movie, but I would love to talk about it. It drops the N-bomb, the F-bomb.
It is problematic.
So there are so many problematic scenes in it, and it's a riot.
Well, next week we're starting our Black Christmas series with kind of the movie that put Shane Black on the map, and that is the original Lethal Weapon starring Mel Gibson and Danny Glover. It's going to be fun. I'm excited to talk about it. So
speaking of problematic,
yeah, Mel Gibson, who has a Christmas movie coming out.
Oh boy,
he's problematic.
Have you not seen the trailer for this, Todd? Fat Man.
What?
Fat Man. It's the name of the. Oh my god! I'm sending you the trailer. I'm gonna
really.
text it to you.
Oh, okay.
It'll be pretty insane.
It looks fun.
I'm looking forward to it.
And rate, review, send this episode to your friends, all your friends who are into Batman, or your friends who are maybe into action movies, like we're going to start talking about next week. So we're all over the map genre wise. I know you guys thought we were just going to be a horror movie podcast after we did 10 weeks of George Romero, but we're going to be all over the place genre wise.
Yeah, we appreciate you guys listening and the positive feedback we've gotten. It's been a blast. And stick with us because we have reasons we're doing all these series, and I think you'll find them fun. And we're going to get even weirder after Christmas, probably. So,
definitely, yes,
definitely.
And reach out to each of us online. Reach out to the show, but we are all very available online to discuss nerdy things, film and otherwise.
Give Todd a reach around.
Well, speaking of which, where can you guys be found on the internet if people want to reach around to you?
Okay, if we're going with the reach round, I am at Mr. Todd A. Davis on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, limited edition COVID
t-shirt.
You do have a t-shirt, Gary.
Yeah, so
I'm the only one here without a t-shirt.
So that's true. So
somebody designed me a t-shirt.
Jack Odinson spent sporting them with his actual guns. Where
he looks better in a sleeveless than you do, Gary.
It's true. Yes.
Nobody
until
cared
next
who
week,
he was until he put on the mask.
And follow us at cinema_shock on Twitter and Instagram. We're also on Facebook. Until next week.
May the wings of liberty never lose a wait.
May the wings of liberty never lose a feather.
Be excellent to each other.
Jonah has the keys.
Jonah Nolan?
Instead of Johnny, I'd said Jonah.
Oh, that you did say Jonah. I thought I was misunderstanding. Okay.
Oh, that's good.
I like that. That's called a callback.
Yeah, that's a bit of a callback.
All right.
Professional comedian available for parties, bar mitzvahs, corporate events.
We'll see.